Hey, everybody. Happy Trans Day of Visibility. I'm here and I'm visible. I'm Eli. My pronouns are they, them. This is Magnus. His pronouns are he, him. Magnus is our straight stitch workforce of a machine who tends to rush in. And today, I'm sewing cloth masks that have been mostly done, have been serged and pleated and the elastics put in, and I'm just going to top stitch all around the edges and talk. And I thought, because today is Trans Day of Visibility, and the way that I know to be visible and to be memorable is to tell stories, I thought today would be a day to tell stories to people. Sound off in chat if Magnus starts to drown me out, because that could be a thing that happens. But I am going to be talking over Magnus as much as I can. And let's see. Let's see how it goes. I had a whole list of stories, and I put a whole bunch of them up on Tumblr and on Twitter and on Facebook. And I know some people requested like a couple of them. I know someone requested my Fidel Castro story, which is a true one and a real one. 18 years ago, I met Fidel Castro face to face, and that story was so good that I think I'm gonna save it. That one's gonna come a little bit later. I need to build up to telling the Fidel Castro story because I need to get back into my storytelling groove and remember exactly how it goes. I mean it. Like, that story made it into a couple of news articles. It was that good. So before that, I want to talk about, well, maybe a little bit about my family. Oh, yes, I should mention that Krista, my partner, is in chat and is staying at home, and they're totally fine. And yeah, it's just me in the studio today. If you have any questions or if you want to hear a story, a particular story, let me know. You know what? It's Trans Day of Visibility. Let me start with my coming out story. That's a good one. So I moved to New York City in the spring of 2010. I actually moved on Valentine's Day, and then it snowed the next day. And it was like, oh, welcome to New York, you Texan. Have a bunch of snow. And I sort of just landed there in, the middle of the Great Recession, trying to find a job as a 23-year-old, 25. God, I was 25. Anyways, I was just out of college and just out of the one thing that I knew how to do and trying to find a job in New York City. And my one saving grace is that I'm bilingual. So I applied for jobs that would need someone who spoke both English and Japanese. But most of the jobs in New York City, at least at the time, that required that were medical or legal jobs, and I had no medical training and no legal training. So the other Japanese translator and interpreter jobs were very oddball. I had a 3-week stint of interpreting for ballerinas at the Bolshoi Ballet Academy in Connecticut. They had 10 Japanese ballerinas between the ages of 11 and 14, and I was their full-time interpreter and camp counselor for 3 weeks. And it was fun, but it was also, 12-hour working days and below minimum wage for a real ass job. So I kept looking, and I kept looking for more or less regular, at least part-time jobs that would take my language skills. And I found an art gallery, an art gallery in Midtown Manhattan. And Chris is reminding me that when I moved, it was a really bad winter. God, yeah, 2010 it was rough. I got the job at the art gallery in, fall of 2010 or spring of 2011, somewhere in there. And what they needed was a native English speaker who could understand all of the native Japanese speakers who worked there, but who could phrase things, a localizer essentially for captions, little placards for the art pieces. It was antiquities mostly, objects, paintings and scrolls and artifacts from pre-16th century. And they would have these very detailed and technical explanations for why this or that scroll was significant or what this particular mantra meant in 16th century Buddhism. And then they would hand that to me like, okay, we sort of know what this means in English, but can you make it understandable? Which is how I sort of accidentally became a scholar of medieval Japanese religion, is one scroll at a time, essentially, because I would have these incredible primary sources right there in front of me. And I would get to look at them and try to read a little bit, but mostly I would try to read these scholarly papers written in Japanese about what they said. That was as far as I got language-wise, but I learned a whole lot. And every year in New York City, except probably not this year, but most years in the springtime, all of the Asian art galleries and antiquities dealers would have an event called Asia Week, where together they would all get their best exhibits out, and they would exhibit either, they would have, the Met would have a special exhibit, the other things, the Guggenheim would have a special exhibit, and our gallery teamed up with a bunch of other galleries to hold an exhibit in the Ukraine Institute over on Museum Mile. And we had Asia Week every year where those of us who were gallery assistants and curators, essentially, it was our job to interact with museum collectors and academics and art dealers everywhere would come to New York City for Asia Week because they knew this was the moment when something really unique and special would come out of a gallery and maybe go into their collection and maybe end up in a museum in Minneapolis or a museum in Portland or a museum somewhere or a university collection somewhere. And I would, of course, have to study up a lot for Asia Week because Asia Week is when people who spoke fluent English would come up to my fellow gallery assistants and ask them like a really esoteric question. My coworkers would look at them and go, my colleague speaks better English than me. Because that's what I was there for, really, is I was there to interpret between the English-speaking academics and the native Japanese art scholars. God, that was a fun job. I loved it. You know what I didn't love, though? I didn't love being out in public, talking to professionals and real people who I admired, wearing a skirt. I hated that. I didn't know why at the time, but I hated it. It sucked every day doing that. It sucked. And the second year I did Asia Week, I did it in a suit. And I wasn't even thinking very much about what that meant. I just knew that I wanted to be in a suit. So I was in a suit. I had pants and a suit jacket and a tie that I really liked. It was this hand-painted silk tie that I'd gotten at a thrift shop. It looked so freaking good. And at the end of that week, when I was in a suit and tie, my very traditional Japanese boss looked at me and she smiled a little sort of smile. And she said to me in Japanese, maybe next year we'll all go shopping together and we can all be in kimono. And bless her heart, it was a really, really nice offer. It was a super nice offer. She looked at me, her assistant, her employee, and she thought, this person isn't dressing the way that I want this person to be dressed for my image and my gallery's image and for like presenting the art that I am trying to present and sell and show off. So I will help this person. I will take them shopping. It was a nice offer. And it sent me into a panic and a down spiral. It sucked. I took my paycheck for that week, which was more than any other paycheck in the whole year because I was actually working full time for 1 week in the year. And I took it to a bar Yes, I did. No, I took it down to Soho and I took it to a shoe shop and I bought myself a pair of high heels. And it was the first pair of high heels that I had ever owned that fit me, and they were so expensive and they were so pretty. And I tried them on and I bought them and I hated myself. And when I took the remainder of my paycheck to a bar and I drank. And then at the end of the night, I realized that I was in a bar in a relatively good neighborhood in Manhattan, but pretty far from home, with expensive shoes in a bag and no idea what I was doing with my life or who I really was. So I texted a friend who happened to live close to that bar, and I said, "Can I please come over? I'm drunk." And when you're 25 or 26 and have similar 20-something friends in Manhattan, this is not a text. This was not the first time I had received such a text. And the friend who took it received it very well and took me in. And I walked, I think, 4 or 5 blocks and landed on their couch, my friend and the roommate. And the two of them were the first ones to hear out loud when I said, "I don't think I'm a woman." And that was big and important and powerful. And I belted it out drunk at, 3 in the morning over a pair of high-heeled shoes and Japanese art. It was one of these sort of, maybe it's a classic story of a 20-something, but it felt very cliched afterwards that I had just had this drunken confession. But it mattered, and I kept it. And by when I say I kept it, what I mean is the next day I didn't go back on it. The next week, when I was still thinking about it, I bought a binder and I looked at myself and how I looked in that binder, and I thought about it really hard. And I talked with my then girlfriend, now wife, about it. But the whole catalyst was that art show and my very nice, very Japanese traditional boss looking at me and going, and me having this incredible visceral reaction to her reaction to me in a suit. I guess that's not really my coming out story. That's my gender crisis story. I came to my gender realizations relatively late in life because I'm 26 in the time of this story, and I'm 34 now. And the number of people I know who have said, maybe not I've always known, but people who have said like, "Oh, I've known since I was a teenager, I've known since I was in middle school." I think those folks are really cool. I think y'all are really cool. And also, I dissociated from my own body so hard throughout my entire teenage years. I had no idea. None. Until I was 26. Imagine that. It can take that long or longer sometimes to figure it out. And maybe if I hadn't spent like a solid week performing a very specific kind of professional service femininity, maybe it would have taken me longer. So that's my gender crisis story. Should we go back or forward? Oh, I do want you to know that there's a rapidly filling bin of masks right underneath the laptop. I sort of sanitize my whole laptop and laptop stand deal. So every time I put a mask here, that means there's one more mask heading out to the hospital. So chat says back, And Krista says, back to what? And well, let's see. Prior to New York, my stories are in Japan. They're in small town coastal Japan on the Hellmouth. I can talk about my time on the Hellmouth because I lived on the Hellmouth in Japan for a year. There's I'm not going to tell any college stories, not today. But there's family stories. There's all the family stories. I have a lot of good family stories. I could jump way back 2 or 3 or 4 generations if you like. My mother's side of the family keeps stories from great-great-grandmothers. Simple ones, short ones, but ones that sort of keep us in memory of people who are now long since gone, people who everyone who knew them personally is now gone. But we know them from their stories. I think I'm going to tell one of those. Yeah, let's go way back to Uncle Charlie. Uncle Charlie, everyone in my family, in my mother's side of the family, when we're telling this story, we call him Uncle Charlie. I believe he was my great-great-grandmother's Uncle Charlie. He belonged to that side of the Duns and the Pardews. Yeah, I think he's back in there. But anyways, Uncle Charlie was a bachelor all his days. This is in rural Kentucky, by the way. And here is a guy who did 2 things. He carved tombstones and he kept goats. And that's what he did. And he said he liked carving tombstones because when someone needed one, they would come to him. He did not have to go out and sell them. He wasn't a big believer in marketing or sales or anything like that. He was good at it, so when people needed one, they showed up at his door. And otherwise, people didn't show up at his door much because he was out in, I say rural Kentucky, and sometimes that means a street with some houses around it, and sometimes that means a shop and some stuff around it, and sometimes that means a farmhouse and a ways, and then a farmhouse, and then another ways. And that's what I mean when I talk about where Uncle Charlie was. No, that's not true. He had a couple of close neighbors, and by close neighbors, we mean 5-minute walk. So Uncle Charlie kept goats, and every now and again, out there in the middle of nowhere, it would have been a while since the last time someone asked him for a tombstone to carve. And so he'd get bored and lonely, and he wouldn't see anybody for ages, for days on a time. And so what he would do is he would go out to the field where his goats were, and he would unlatch the gate and he would open it. And the goats would leave. They'd go, and they'd find their way to one of the neighbors' farms, and they'd start munching on the crops. And sure enough, one of his neighbors would come banging on his door, Charlie, your goats are in my crops again. And he would go and say, well, I'm really sorry about that. And he would go collect his goats. And he'd round them up, and they would more or less go quietly. And that was about all the excitement Uncle Charlie really wanted. That'd last him another month or 2, really. And that was Uncle Charlie. And to this day, in my family, we call it sometimes, when you need to shake things up a little bit, we call it letting the goats out. Mom used to say that when we go on a trip that we hadn't really planned in advance. She'd say, let's just let the goats out. Let's just go. There's a lot of stories like that I've got from family in rural Kentucky. Passed down, told. The Uncle Charlie story I've told to you pretty much word for word the way my mother would tell it to me, because she had a formula for it. There was a sequence of events and steps that you have to take to tell this story right. And that's really important for a lot of the stories in my family. I've just run out of thread on this spool, so I'm going to rethread it. Give me a second. Yeah, that'll do. Okay. Yes, this is true. It's important to set up the punchline. Every story, and this is true for both sides of my family, and every story, you have to set up the punchline. No matter what kind of story you're telling, even if the punchline can be like something that sort of alleviates something that's otherwise really sad, it's very, very important to like follow a formula and go through it. I have another story like that actually from my dad's side. This is the story of my granddad in his first years in his house in Townsend, which is just 40 minutes up the road from here. And that house in Townsend is the reason we live in Brattleboro. So I'm going to tell that story now because it's a lovely story and it demonstrates what Chris is mentioning about setting up the punchline. This is a story about my grandfather, the economist. This is my dad's dad. He sold a few books in the 1950s, which hit the New York Times top bestseller list and paid for a house up here, essentially. And as a Canadian farm boy at heart, need some water, hang on. As a Canadian farm boy, my granddad wanted nothing more than a farmhouse and what he called an unfarmed farm, a space that could be farmed in the event or the need. But really what it was a little bit of land up in the woods, up the mountain. It's got like a foot of topsoil over the sheer rock, maybe two in some places. And he would go up there every summer thereafter to write a book. And that's what he did. He was a professor in the fall and spring semester, and then in the summer, he would leave Boston and go to Vermont and write a book. And he had a very, a strict regimen about book writing up there, like you need to do if you're on your own and in solitude. And what he did was he would get up in the morning and go down the road from the farmhouse to his study, which was a separate structure, which he'd caused to be constructed, which was essentially, a single room space with a tiny kitchenette and a bathroom, and for him, a typewriter and encyclopedias on the shelves. And Granddad would go up there and he would write for a few hours. And then he would take a walk, and then he would be back to the main farmhouse in time for lunch, usually with my two grandmas, with Grandma Kitty and Grandma Emily, and in later years also with kids. And then he would go back to the study and write again. So he's also, at this point, a pretty well-known economist, and occasionally gets calls from various people like the president now and again for economics advice. And at this point, we're in the early 1960s, and the president is Kennedy. And he did, in fact, advise Kennedy in economics through his campaign. So JFK knew him. And so it's the summer of 1961. Yeah, it's the summer of 1961, and Granddad's in Vermont writing a book. He gets up in the morning, he goes to the study, he starts writing. He finishes writing, he goes on his walk, and he walked through a storm the night before. And a branch has fallen on the lines, and there's a crew there fixing the phone lines. And it's like the first strangers he's seen in a while, so he says, "Good morning," and they say, "Good morning," and he walks on. And he walks a little further down the road, and further down the road, there in the woods in the middle of nowhere, the phone line's down again. There's another branch. I mean, it happens. And there's a second crew there working on it, fixing the phone line. So he says, "Good morning," and they say, "Good morning." And then he keeps walking because he has a particular circuit that he takes when he goes on his walks. And he gets a little further down the dirt road, and there's a third place where a branch has fallen and the phone line is down, and there's a third crew there, a different telephone crew fixing the phone lines. And he says, "Good morning." And they say, "Good morning." And he reaches the end of his walk and he turns around and he walks back. And as he's getting back to the farmhouse for lunch, he sees that the first crew that he saw is just about finished up, and they're finishing up and packing up and ready to go. And he gets into the house and the phone rings and he answers it. And it's President John F. Kennedy. And the first thing President Kennedy says is, "Ken, I tried to call you before, but the phone lines were down. So I called the governor and told him to get it fixed." Oh. I love that story. I love that Granddad knew. Granddad knew in that moment that he was listening, that he was on the phone with JFK and laughing his ass off. He knew this is a story. Because for decades after, he told this story to all of us in the exact same way. He told it to us with that rhythm, with the three crews. And I realized maybe when I was 10 or 11 that Dad told the story in the exact same way that Granddad did. That Dad had, in fact, internalized Granddad's storytelling methods there. He said it with the same rhythm. He said the same thing about "good morning, good morning." And so I learned to tell stories not only from the way that my family tells stories, but also from the way that my family imitates each other telling stories. And also, come on, it's a good goddamn story, especially if you live or have ever lived in a rural area and you know for a fact that 3 phone crews on a single dirt road in the middle of the woods is wild. Never would happen. Except apparently when the president calls the governor and says, "Fix this one phone line so I can call this one professor in the middle of goddamn nowhere." I shouldn't say goddamn nowhere. Townsend is super nice and I love it up there. Townsend, that house up in Townsend is where my grandparents' ghosts are. And I mean that in the most loving way possible. It is where all of our memories of them live. You can go up to that house in Townsend if you're one of us in the family, and look around and see them there, just as if they're right around the corner, as if Granddad's sitting down in that study at his typewriter, starting the next book. The man wrote a little under 50 books in his lifetime. And the way he managed that was to be a tenured professor and to go up there every summer and write one. So Granddad's ghost is in this study, and you can feel it there. I keep my beekeeping stuff in the study when I keep bees, and I'll talk about keeping bees later. And I always am very careful to move Granddad's stuff and stack it nicely so that there is room for my stuff. I think he'd really approve of me beekeeping. And I make sure not to, mess up any of his papers. Grandma Kitty is in the garden. Sometimes she's in the ponds. She had a habit, not a habit. She had like a true routine, just like Granddad did. Granddad's routine was he'd get up and he'd go start writing a book. Grandma Kitty's routine was that she would get up before him and she would go down the dirt road towards the beaver pond. And she would jump in the beaver pond at 6 or 7 in the morning when it was so cold up there. I mean, look, we're talking summertime, but summertime in Townsend, Vermont, we're talking 65 degrees in the sunlight. And it's not sunlit at 7 in the morning in the woods. It's dark and it's cold. And my Grandma Kitty was 4'8" and 98 pounds soaking wet. Like, phooey. Is video not playing? Can anyone see my video? Can you like sound off in chat if you can see me? If there's technical difficulties, I'm going to stop. Okay, great. Someone can see me. Lovely. It might be a trouble on Krista's side. Hope not. Great. Okay. I'm going to keep going because I'm talking about my Grandma Kitty and a freezing cold pond in the middle of the woods and hope that Krista comes back. Okay. Refresh if it doesn't work and hopefully it will come back. Sorry. Where was I? Oh yes. Grandma Kitty in the woods. So my Grandma Kitty, 4'8" and like a tiny human being, like just a very like not only short but like wispy, like you could sneeze and knock her over kind of human being. And she would get up at 6 in the morning and go jump in the freezing cold waters and swim around this giant beaver pond. And when I say a beaver pond, I mean a pond where beavers lived, like it was between 2 dams built by beavers in this series of ponds through the woods. And the beavers had built the dams basically sectioning off this river. And it was a beautiful clear pond. It was a tea pond, which is what it's called when the cedar trees all around it stain it, sort of this reddish tea stain. And it smelled lovely and it looked lovely. And yes, it did have leeches, but that's the woods for you. And Grandma Kitty did not mind the leeches. She just hopped in, got freezing cold, came back out, started her day. And that's where she is. And sometimes when I go swimming in that pond, I think Grandma Kitty's swimming like right over there next to me. Just, across the way. Grandma Emily is in the pine trees. Krista would like to say giant leeches. And like, I haven't seen a giant leech in there in years. They probably are still there though. The horse leeches, 6 inches long and bright orange. Yeah. God, where was I? Grandma Emily. Grandma Emily's in the pine trees. There's a copse of pine trees halfway between the beaver pond and the study. And they were saplings when Grandma Emily planted them. And now they are the tallest thing on the property some 70 years later. And I think Grandma Emily would be absolutely tickled to know that her pine trees are taller than everything because she was the shortest. I mentioned that Grandma Kitty was kind of a tiny person and a wisp. Grandma Emily was not a tiny person. She was broad-shouldered and had incredible presence and force, but she was the shortest. And so the fact that her pine trees are taller than everything, I think she'd be real smug about that. I still pine trees and talk to her sometimes. It's where we scattered her ashes. I love Grandma Emily. I miss Grandma Emily so much. She was the first of them to go 20 years ago now. And there's a wonderful story about Grandma Emily that I'm going to tell you now. And it's another story set in the Townsend house. And first, I'm going to blow my nose because I can feel just a little allergy sniffle coming on. There we go. It's allergy season. Actually, give me a minute. about Grandma Emily in just a moment. There we go. Hand hygiene is important, though. There we go. So, right, Grandma Emily. This is a little bit later. We're not in 1961 anymore. We're in 1966 or 67. Yeah, I want to say we're in LBJ years. And Granddad is kind of less welcome in the White House and at general advisory things at this point, because he keeps telling LBJ that he needs to get out of Vietnam. And LBJ does not want to hear that. So Granddad he's called less often. But now and again, he's still called on various and sundry economic advisories, because it's still kind of important to keep the economy running. And he was considered something of an authority, regardless of his views on the war. So one day, Granddad's working. It's morning. He hasn't even gone on his walk yet. He's just up in the study writing that year's book. And I mentioned the study is far away from the main house. So when the phone rings at the main house, you don't hear it at the study. And the phone rings at the main house, and Grandma Emily, who at this point is employed by Granddad, she is cooking the meals and raising his kids, looking after his kids. She answers the phone and the person on the other end of the phone says, essentially, "This is the White House. We'd like to speak with Professor Galbraith, please." This is Professor Galbraith, my granddad, by the way, Professor Galbraith. If that means something to you, great. If not, don't worry about it. But yeah, the person on the other end of the phone says, "This is the White House, and we'd like to speak with Professor Galbraith, please." And she says, "Well, Professor Galbraith is working right now. You'll need to call back at noon when he takes his lunch." And she hangs up. She gets a call back in about 3 minutes from the secretary to the president. And the secretary to the president says, "This is the secretary to the president. The president would like to speak with Professor Galbraith, please." And Grandma Emily says, "Well, I'm sorry, but Professor Galbraith is busy at work and left orders that he is not to be disturbed. You're going to have to call back. He takes lunch at noon." She hangs up. 5 minutes later, she gets another call. And on the phone, she hears, "This is the president. Get me Ken Galbraith on the phone right now." And she says, "Well, I'm sorry, Mr. President, but I work for him and not you." Hangs up the phone. Granddad comes in about 5 minutes to noon after his walk and asks if there were any calls. And when he gets done laughing, he calls the White House back. And he gets on the line with LBJ. And LBJ says, first thing that LBJ says to him is, "Ken, who is that woman? I need her to come work for me." But she didn't. She stayed with Granddad and Grandma Kitty, and she became my Grandma Emily. Grandma Emily was the best. She was so I mentioned she was the shortest, and this is a big deal in my family because of the height difference between these three people. Is that Grandma Emily comes in at like 4'7", and Grandma Kitty at like 4'8", 4'9", and Granddad's up there at 6'8". Like the height difference is, when you see it in photos, it's really stunning. Granddad and Grandma Kitty are often photographed together with Grandma Kitty standing up on a step, and she's still head and shoulders shorter than him. Like, it's a running joke, and also it's just a big deal in my family because we all sort of wanted to see who would get whose genes, and we would all get together, all us grandkids growing up, we would get together and have height competitions and measure each other at the back to back, and have someone else like set a ruler and see who's taller this year, who's taller this year. There was an ongoing height competition especially between the 6 elder grandkids, and I am the youngest of that crop. There were 2 crops of grandkids, really, and I am the youngest of the 6. And it was a fun balance, really, for a while there. We had, 2 blondes, 2 brunettes, 2 redheads, 3 vegetarians, 3 non-vegetarians. There was a lot of balance, 3 brown eyes, 3 blue eyes. Like, there was an interesting sort of mix of balances between these kids, all of us. And my cousins and my brother and I would get together every summer before we went up to Townsend. We would stop at the grandparents' place in Boston, and we would have a little height competition, and we would see who was tallest. And for a long while there, the 3 eldest sons, and that's my older brother and my 2 cousins, were just neck and neck and neck, or rather, crown and crown and crown. And the eldest, cousin David, topped out at, I think, 6'1", and a half. And so then it was just my brother and our cousin Andrew. And the 2 of them kept going for a little bit. And then something kind of sad but kind of funny happened to Andrew. He's fine. He's totally fine. But he snowboarded off a cliff and landed on both feet on his snowboard. And when he recovered from that, he was an inch shorter because he'd compressed his spine. And this is one of those things that I would not have believed could happen to a person, except cousin Andrew came back one summer and we measured him against my brother, and my brother wins. And he's the tallest of the grandkids, the end. God, I knew I was never going to be the tallest, but I'm glad I got to be tall enough. My battery's about to run out, so I'm going to plug this in a minute. Someone says, Krista says that I should tell everyone about the shenanigans involved and how we found out that there was only 1 to 3 feet of topsoil up there. I will do that when I plug in my computer. Oh, God, that's a good story. Probably should have plugged in before I started streaming, but whatever, I'm not a professional. There's this. There's this. There you go. There, that's fixed. Okay. So, the story of the topsoil is a story about bees. There were a lot incredibly soothing, actually, to open up a beehive and see just the hum of umpty thousand small creatures between my arms. That's incredible. There's nothing like beekeeping. Just nothing. And there's also like a rush of adrenaline too. If you accidentally knock against the hive, or you slip, or you open something the wrong way, and the whole hive goes like a motorcycle revving all at once. And you have to learn how to keep your cool, which I definitely had trouble with. I'm a high-strung individual. Beekeeping was hard in that, but finding serenity in beekeeping was, if you can find it there, You can find it almost anywhere. So beekeeping was a lot of fun, but the really, really hard part about beekeeping up in the woods, in the mountains in Vermont, is bears. There are a lot of bears up there. Brown bears are everywhere up there. And we had a fence that was around the orchard where the bees were. And by orchard, I mean like 10 saplings that Dad had planted in the hope of peaches someday. But the bears figured out that they could just lean on the fence and lean on it and lean on it. And it was this metal fence with metal poles in the ground, and the poles would just bend. And then the fence would be down, and then the bears could come in and get at those bees. And even if the bees fought them off, which they did many times, even if the bees fought them off and they did not get at any honey, I would still know that a bear had been there because, one, there would be claw marks on the wooden boxes, on the beehives. Black bears. Thank you, Chris. Black bears. Also, someone says, oh, thank you. Someone says that they like the way I tell stories. Yes. So there would be claw marks on the wooden boxes of the beehives. And one time I did find a raked claw mark and a tuft of hair left there, that wiry, bristly hair. And it's like, yeah, there was a bear here. And the other reason you could tell right away that a bear had been by is the bees were angry. Bees did not want a beekeeper there. Bees did not want me coming in. They did not want me opening up the box. They did not want anything to do with me for a while after any bear attack. So we started looking into bear repellent, and the one thing that everyone says first is an electric fence. An electric fence out in the middle of nowhere, the best way to power it is solar power. And when you know it, there are solar-powered batteries that you can install on basically a wooden post, set it up so that it gets enough sunlight, and it will power a fence that can then hopefully shock a bear away from bees, hopefully. So we got the fence, we unrolled it, we stuck it in the ground, we got the battery, we shoved a post in the ground. That's how I first learned how to use a post holer, is to mount that battery in a space where it would get sunlight. And we got this thing that I don't actually understand how electricity works really well, but I guess a solar-powered battery and a circuit needs a ground, and a grounding element in this case was literally an 8-foot copper rod. And you're supposed to take this 8 feet of copper that's like an inch thick, and you're supposed to drive it straight down into the ground. And that's supposed to make something safer or do something. It's supposed to make it safe to have an electric fence out in the middle of nowhere in a wet field, whatever. I don't really get it. I just saw all of the instructions being like, you need to do this. You need to have the wire from your battery connected to the ground, and the ground needs to be this 8-foot copper rod that's 8 feet down in the earth. It's got to go straight down into the earth. And I went, okay. And I read some things and looked at diagrams and whatever, and eventually decided I just don't get it, but other people smarter than me get it, and that's good enough, so I'll do it. So in the installation, what's that? Oh, it's fine. In the installation process, we tried to sink an 8-foot copper rod straight down into the earth. I mentioned that we're on a mountain. Yeah, that copper rod got about a foot down. And then it was just solid. It was not going anywhere. There was no way it was going any further at all. And we moved it around a few times, and we found a place that had maybe 18 inches, 2 feet. But the simple fact is, if you're on a mountain like that, there's 2 feet of topsoil, and then there's rock. There's just mountain under there. You're not getting copper in there without some freaking industrial equipment, which we did not have. We did not even have a step ladder. And at this point, we're being helped out by a friend of Dad's who helps take care of the place, and he is laughing about it. He's the one who brought the post holer, and he is laughing even as we attempt this, and he's gamely attempting it with us. And he finally says, you know what? It's probably just as well or like as good as if it goes in sideways. And we thought about that, and we thought about what we knew about electricity and electrical engineering. It's not much. And we were like, okay. Also, we were sweaty and tired and had blisters on our hands. So we shoved this copper rod in at an angle, and you could feel the point at which it started to hit the rock and skid along the rock as we buried this. As we buried 8 feet of copper into the earth. And 8 feet of copper is still in the earth. And we may have to move that copper if and when we move the whole beekeeping setup. I gave up on beekeeping after 3 straight years of bears wrecking the hives and making my bees really angry, and then the bees not surviving the winter or not staying the winter. And I'm going to come back to it, but with a couple of different strategies. And one of them is I'm going to move the bees further away from the tree line, so they're further away from the bears. And a few other things. I miss them, though. I miss having bees. I miss keeping bees. My first hive was named Watson, so that their queen could be named Joan, because I was big into elementary at the time. And Queen Joan was the best. She was an amazing queen. I say she, but I have feelings about bee genders, about gendering bees based on reproductive ability, about how bees have 3 genders, and worker is the most powerful one. I could talk about bees for a while, but that's not really storytelling. That's just special interest ramble. Right. Yes. Krista would like to make it super clear that she did, in fact, look it up online to make sure that it would be okay to bury that rod sideways before we did it. I'd forgotten that. Yeah, and black bears are chill in that they do run off, and I've never actually encountered one outside of a car. But they do piss off bees, something of these masks. I'm really happy about that. Those freaking bears. We did see a black bear from the inside of a car once. We were driving back down the mountain from that place, and it was 11 at night, and it was after a late dinner with my dad, and the headlights hit on a shadow, and it was this weird, my first thought seeing that shadow was elongated dog. It was just this weird big dog with super long legs, and that's what I got from it. And then it reflected off the eyes, and then sort of the darkness filled in around it, and it was like, oh, bear on the road crossing in front of us. Hello, bear. I think maybe I'm done talking about the house on the mountain for a while. I've at least told like the 2 presidential stories about it, which are the really good ones. Well, a few of the really good ones. So I've gone back to the 1960s. Should I go forward or back from there? Further back. The claw-footed bathtub story is a story from 1934. And it's a story from my Grandma Kitty. My Grandma Kitty was a lawyer's daughter on Long Island when the Great Depression hit. And the Depression meant that her lawyer dad in Long Island was suddenly out of work. And she started working to help support people. She was a camp counselor and things of that nature. Also, she was also a bilingual camp counselor, actually. I've just realized that she and I were both bilingual camp counselors. Oh my gosh, there's a thought. She had several people living at home. Like her grandparents were living with her dad. Her grandfather was an inventor. He invented the calorie meter, actually, which he didn't get credit for before he died, but she remembers him doing all sorts of experiments to make the calorie meter come into existence. What camp? Oh, I don't know what camp my Grandma Kitty was the camp counselor at. I know it's in her memoirs because I know she got that far in her memoirs. But I just know that it was out on Long Island somewhere. That she would drive out there. No, she wouldn't. Would she have driven out there? She would have been driven out there or probably gotten a train to wherever it was and done a summer's worth of taking care of littler ones, and probably in multiple languages. My Grandma Kitty was before the Depression. She was one of these kids who got a bilingual nanny, so she learned how to speak German as a 3-year-old, which is probably one of the reasons she was so multilingual through her whole life. She always told all of us grandkids that the 4th language is the hardest, but her 4th language was Hindi, so of course it was going to be hard. And she said after the 4th language, she said after the 4th language, it gets easier from there. And this was like her way of encouraging us to go further. I think she had maybe 8 languages by the time she was in her 90s. She could speak a lot. God, maybe I'm getting that wrong. Maybe the 4th language is the easiest. Who knows? Who knows now? But Grandma Kitty worked really hard as a teenager, got a scholarship to Smith, which is actually only 40 minutes down the road the other way from the house for me. Went to Smith College in the early 1930s and managed to get into Smith College's last pre-war study abroad program to Europe. So she was on this program where she got to go to Spain and then to Germany in 1934. And she was one of maybe a dozen American students from Smith who got to do this. And she went to Spain first and landed on the coast and then got transport to Madrid. And on the road from the Spanish coast to Madrid, she saw refugees, because we are here at the end of the Spanish Civil War in 1934. End? Maybe not the end. We're in the middle of a lot of war in 1934 in Spain. And what she sees is people carrying their whole lives on their backs going down the road in the same direction that she's going towards the capital, going towards Madrid. And she sees people pushing baby carriages full of objects. She sees people pulling their luggage behind them. She sees people carrying steamer trunks, 2 people to a trunk. She sees people with huge bales of things on their head. And then she sees something that she never forgot. She sees a young woman, 19 years old, maybe 20, standing straight up, straight as a rod, with a claw-footed bathtub balanced on her head, walking down the side of the road towards Madrid. And Grandma Kitty, also around 19 at this point, looks. She looks and she watches this girl as she's driven out of sight. And she writes it down in her journal, and she writes it down in a diary later, and she tells her children this story, and she tells her grandchildren this story, because she never forgets. She never forgets that one girl, teenager, in Spain, carrying a claw-footed bathtub on her head down the side of the road in the middle of the war. That's the claw-footed bathtub story. People have heard that story and suggested to me that it was a prop, that it was made out of foam or something, which I think highly unlikely in 1934. But I understand the impulse to be like, no, no one can do that. But no, people can do that. I have seen people carry extremely heavy things balanced on their head, walking for great distances, because I lived in rural India for half a year. So, like, it can be done. Seen it done. Bathtub, though. What an image, right? I'm going to refill my water. You should get hydrated too. Krista says, I gotta run and I'll be back in an hour, and we'll see if we're still going in an hour, hey? While I'm hydrating, forward or back? I don't know if I can, no, I can definitely go further back than 1933, but I can also go forward. Forward. There's actually a lot of ground to cover between 1933 and now. Let's see. Is it time for the Castro story? Maybe not yet. Let me tell you about the Hellmouth. Hellmouth is a good story. I love the Hellmouth. So I graduated college into the recession in 2008. And I took the very first job that was offered to me, which I had applied for, which was to be a JET, which is to say, I joined the Japan Exchange and Teaching Program to go be a native English speaker teaching English to Japanese public school kids in Japan. And it was funded by the Japanese government, and you become an assistant teacher. So you get teacher training as you do it. And it's an extremely good program. For a recent college graduate, it was probably the best I could have gotten. It paid very well. I paid for a year of grad school off of my JET salary. It was just so nice. And they ask on the application whether you have a preference between an urban or a rural area, and I said no, so they sent me to a rural area, and this was my first time really living in small town anywhere, was living in small town Japan. And I didn't know a whole lot about the place I was assigned, Kumano, before I went. I knew generally where it was on the coast, but it took me a while to really find out and parse and sort of absorb the story. And here's how the story goes. In early days, back when Japan had only just emerged from the waters, the sun goddess, Amaterasu, landed in Ise, which is in the middle of the mountains. And she lands in Ise and she walks south across the tops of the mountains until she reaches the coast. And there on the coast is the Hellmouth. And she finds the Hellmouth and she settles there and she stands guard over the Hellmouth to keep the demons from coming out onto the earth. And the path that she walked is a literal path across tops of mountains, because these mountains are really rolling, and they're not too high and steep, and there are hiking trails now, trails and paths that you can follow from Ise to the coast that literally take you up over one mountain and down the next and over the next and down the next. And I hiked one of these. It's really was pretty gentle, honestly, as a hike goes. And also it was very, very cool to hike a path that had been marked out by Buddhist monks retracing the goddess's steps hundreds or thousands of years ago. And that was really neat. And then it dawned on me that, we're at the end of the pilgrimage. That means we're at the end of the goddess's journey. That means I'm living on the Hellmouth. That's just where we lived. That's where it was. It was a super nice place to live. It was sort of subtropical in terms of rainfall. It rained almost every day. It was warm and sunny and wet and green and lush. And there were craggy cliffs next to the ocean, and when the waves splashed against the cliffs in just the right way, they made the most incredible sounds, and that's where the demons were supposed to live. And every month or so, a pilgrimage would arrive in town, because people to this day take this pilgrimage from Ise to Kumano. And they do it in groups, and it's something like a tour group to see people who all have the same hat or who have the same flag on their belt or something, and who have come into town, who have just together been hiking for a month, and they have landed at the end of the pilgrimage, and they pay their respects at the temple, and they go to whatever local inn or ryokan they fancy, or maybe their tour group has reserved a block of rooms, usually the latter. And without fail, these regular monthly tourists would see me, this white person, in the midst, and stare. And at first I thought it was funny. And then later it felt a little bit like, you know what, I live here. Like, this is my home. That's my apartment over there. I live here, and I have a visa, and I go to work. And you're the tourist. You're in here for a day or 2 days, and then you will be going back because you have finished your month-long vacation, spiritual journey, hiking trip, whatever they did it for. They did it for the local tourists. But God, I loved going down to that coast. The beach was 3 minutes walk from my apartment, and it would be so foggy in the morning and in the evening. It would just, the fog would blanket the place thick, and pale and ghostly, and there really were demons there, or spirits or something. You could go down to the beach and sit there and hear them, and you would never see them in all that fog. I loved that place. I loved that town. I loved that the local supermarket bought from the fishermen on the coast. Like, literally, there were people who made their livings fishing right there and then selling their catch to the supermarket, which would then clean it and package it and sell it to us consumers. I loved how welcoming people were. They put my name and face in the paper when I got there. And after that, people would see me and address me as sensei because I was there to teach. It was nice. I have a bunch of complicated feelings now about language imperialism and teaching English as a second language, as a government-mandated program. I loved living on the Hellmouth. That was great. It was also kind of super great. Right after I moved out of the Hellmouth, I had a 6-month stint in India teaching English there. Again, my feelings about teaching English as a second language in foreign countries and the sort of language imperialism involved there are myriad and complicated, but whatever. I spent 6 months in India, in rural India, in a tiny town, and my address was, what was it? Behind Electric Station. That was the street and the street number. It was Behind Electric Station. It was my name, and then it was Behind Electric Station, and then the town name, and then the state, and a postal code. And that's all they needed. There was no street name, and there was no house number. The mail person who delivered would know from my name and Behind Electric Station where the letter went. And there were certainly maybe 50 people living in that little neighborhood behind the electric station, but that was, I mean, a name was enough. And I also thought that was really, really funny that my address was Behind Electric Station, because then I moved to New York City. And I ended up in an apartment across the street from the Con Edison electrical fields in Queens. So I had literally moved from one Behind Electric Station to another. Let me tell you, the Con Edison electrical fields in Queens are so much worse. They smell terrible, and though I would not say that they were as frequent an explosion, when there was an explosion or other accident at Con Edison electrical fields, it was worse. It was worse. I think I need a prompt now. I would like to tell another story, but I need a direction to go in. I could tell the Castro story now, but I'm not really feeling it yet. I don't know. Let's say family, school, or gay. Which one of those three? I feel like I've gone through some family stories and some school stories, but maybe not so many stories about being gay in New York. That was a thing. But I feel like those stories are also super common. A lot of people have heard about being gay in New York. Hey, gay is the vote. Okay. So I moved to New York, and I moved to the Con Edison electrical fields next door neighbor space, which was awful. It was a tiny apartment that I found on Craigslist, and I lived next to a guy who could not clean after his mess and attracted roaches, and it was gross, and I got out of there in months. And then I moved in with a former college roommate, and that went, and I moved out. But after, a few rounds of trying to find roommates who I liked and who we could mutually stand each other, I ended up in an apartment full of graduate students in Park Slope. And we weren't all grad students. Okay, I think there was maybe a couple of grad students and a couple of undergrads. Yeah, I want to say undergrads. And a couple of folks who were working, and my face itches, but I'm trying not to touch my face these days. I'm just using a Kleenex. Yep. So, I'm in a crowded but kind of trendy neighborhood in Brooklyn. There is 5 bedrooms in this apartment, and it is tiny, and it is kind of terrible in that it wasn't supposed to have 5 bedrooms. It was definitely supposed to have a dining room and a living room instead. But what it has right now is 5 bedrooms in this weird railroad apartment where 2 of the bedrooms, you have to leave them and go out into the hall to get to go out into like the main apartment complex hall to get into the living room and kitchen. And in the kitchen, there's a window. And the window opens out to a tiny, not quite a courtyard, backyard space to someone else's backyard. Like, we don't have a yard, someone else has a yard. But because the window opens out to the outside, that's where the rain starts to collect when it rains. And this kitchen window, when it rains, gets squishy around the edges, around the wall, around the window, about 2 or 3 inches. When it rained, you could put your hand to the wall next to the window and the wall would give under your hand. And then you would do this and be like, oh, Christ, and not touch it. And we told the landlord, of course. And we told the landlord, and we told the landlord, and we told him again. And then he showed up with a tube of caulk, like bathtub caulk and silicone, and just sort of piped it in at the edges, every crack he could find in the drywall around the window. So he essentially glued the window into place. And he was like, all right, that's done. Which was not reassuring to any of us. And there were 5 of us, and then my girlfriend moved in, and then there were 6 of us. And out of the 6 of us, we had one person who at the time we thought was our token straight friend, who later came out. So this was an extremely gay household. It was an extremely gay and also very trans household, and it was really, really, really nice. It was my first time spending copious amounts of time with other people who were also trans, and wow, that makes a difference. It makes such a huge difference to live next to people who are also like having a hard time with this and that thing, or getting through the day and being misgendered, or getting through the day and being gendered right and having a good day. Like, it made a huge difference to me to live in that space. And when Krista moved in, I was really nervous that it was going to be, just one too many people in a really small space. So I called a house meeting and like literally sort of, laid it out on the table. And it was like, if you want us to move, we will figure it out and move. And they were like, no, you should stay. You should stay. Let's try it out, they said. And then a couple months later, they were like, yeah, you're staying. It was great. It was great. They were lovely and wonderful people. And I miss them all. And one day, in this Park Slope apartment with the squishy window, our token straight friend, our token straight roommate, brought home a boy. And the rest of us were pretty protective of our token straight roommate. And so we wanted to vet the boy. Because what if the boy's no good for her? And, well, let's just say that within about 3 minutes of our impromptu meet the roommates, the boy managed to misgender over half of the people in that apartment. And it was quite clear to our straight friend, like immediately clear, that we did not approve. And though I don't think our say would have been final, like if she had truly liked him and found other redeeming qualities in him, she would not have let the disapproval of her roommates stop her from dating. No, it didn't last. Which is good. Not good that relationships fall through, but good that I have been blessed with friends and roommates who think it is important that people gender me right. And if people don't gender me right, that is a poor reflection on them. Like, if they're gonna sit there and argue, especially, that just betrays like a deep lack of consideration in this world. So there's one gay story. I'm going to tell another now that I'm thinking about it. Now that I'm thinking about the wonderful friends in 2016. Wow. 4 years ago is what I was going to say. In 2016, we moved up here, and we knew we wanted to be in this area because of the house in Townsend, my grandparents' old house in Townsend, because we knew people were nice here. We knew the place was nice. We did not know what we were going to find in terms of gay community, trans community, anything like that. No idea. But we figured we'd give it a shot. It couldn't be any worse than the place in Jersey that we were living then. So we went. We came here. And we moved on April 1st. 4 years ago tomorrow, we moved. Wow. Yeah, we landed here on April 1st, and then 2 days later it snowed. Because that's how that works. It snowed, and we were like, well, I guess this is what it's going to be like. And we hunkered down in our home, in our apartment, for a few months. Just settling, getting our sea legs working mostly on shapeshifters, on chest binders, and figuring out how we were going to run a business in Vermont and live our lives. And then Pride season came around, and it seemed worthwhile to check the local paper and see what kind of stuff was happening. And we saw Pride Family Picnic, that there was a picnic specifically geared towards families at the local park, at an open to the air shelter with picnic benches and a grill and a little kitchenette that's just open to folks who reserve it to use it. And Pride Family Picnic. Okay, sure. Let's go. So we did. We went. And we brought, Krista made lasagna, and I made these cinnamon rolls. No, they weren't cinnamon rolls. They were berry rolls. They were made, instead of with cinnamon, they were made with raspberries and blueberries. Raspberries, mostly. And we both, at the last second, thought to write out ingredients lists for each of these in case of food allergies. And Krista made lasagna, and 2 pans of lasagna, and one was vegetarian. And people really liked it and liked us and like introduced themselves to us by asking, hey, did you make that? Did you bake that? What's your recipe? And thanks for writing out these ingredients. I really needed to know this. And thanks for having a vegetarian option. Like, and there was a whole lot of food, obviously. It was a potluck. But yeah, we distinguished ourselves a little bit, I guess, by trying to be accessible. And made a few really good friends right off the bat. I met a guy there who was a jeweler who made wedding rings and engagement rings. And he's now a colleague of mine in this building, a local jeweler by the name of Will Alderfer. He's really cool, and he makes super nice rings. And I briefly met the organizer, this incredible human being, who HB Lazito introduced himself by saying, hey, everybody, my name's HB, my pronouns are they, them, and then went into their spiel. And to discover that the organizer of this event had they, them pronouns suddenly made me so much more comfortable and happy. Just being there, existing in the same space, being like, oh, trans people are not just here in this family event, just trans person in charge. That helped. That helps a lot, making me feel comfortable and welcome. And I've run out of bobbin thread, so I'm changing my bobbin. And HB is also just really good at making people feel comfortable and welcome. There was nothing quite like coming up to rural Vermont, landing not knowing anyone, coming to a picnic, and immediately making 4 friends. Didn't expect it at all. But the organization that puts on that picnic is called Out in the Open. And here we are 4 years later, I'm on the board. So I'm real involved and real invested now in building and continuing is that we have things like just social calls and community yoga sessions and a mutual aid chat and whatever. It's really nice. It makes you feel less alone. And let me tell you, even before these days, people who are rural and gay have been working for a long time on solutions to feeling less alone. And that's always the trick, isn't it? You gotta look around for someone who has already been solving the problem that you're tackling right now. And you go, what did you do? What did you do? What was your solution? We're coming up on 90 minutes, and I think I might be running out of steam. Anybody want one more story before I go? I think I want to do a quick one. I want to tell you a coming out story, since that's what I said I'd do at the very start. And then I didn't do it. When I came out to my parents, I came out to my mother over the phone. As trans, specifically. Actually, I came out as gay to mom over the phone, too. This is what comes of being distant all the time. So I came out to my mother over the phone, but I came out to my dad in the car. So we were driving from one place to another in backwoods Vermont. And I gave him like a short rehearsed speech that I had prepped in my head approximately 30 seconds before. I just sort of carefully pieced together, and then I said it out loud, start to finish. And he was quiet for a bit, but not like a hostile quiet, just like a quiet, like a I am thinking and processing this quiet. And eventually, what he said to me was, you know, I have a colleague who transitioned when she was 55. And she seems to be doing very well now. She's come out and is out professionally and managed it. Process it was. She took from around the ages of 55 to 60. So, as far as I'm concerned, kiddo, you're ahead of the curve. It's really freaking nice of my dad to be like, the first thing that he thought of to say, first thing that he thought of that he actually like let himself say was, okay, one, I know a trans person, and two, it's fine that you're 26 and doing this. Oh, let's see. I've got 1, 2, that needs to be pinned, that needs to be repleated. 3, 4 left on my top stitching pile. Yeah. I think I'm going to put on some music and finish these. And then I'm going to switch over and start another batch of 20 or maybe 50. Thanks for coming out, guys. Appreciate you.